News Talk 1340 KROC-AM. Good morning. I'm Andy Brownell. Rochester Today on a Tuesday with former Congressman Tim Penny by telephone. And I've been dying to talk to you about this, Tim. The last time we talked was pre-election. And I guess I have to just start out with our conversation of maybe your impressions following what was certainly a Republican victory in a midterm election. It wasn't a surprising victory, but perhaps a little bit stronger than some predicted.
Yeah. I think 9 seats in the Senate, assuming the Louisiana seat goes Republican in early December, that's a pretty sizable pickup. And, going into Election Day, opinion polls showed so many of these races so close that, some people were predicting as few as 3 Republican seats, which would have still left them a vote or two shy of a majority. 9 was sort of at the high end of what they thought the Republicans might be able to achieve, and they got 9. So that's clearly a big shift. I think is this really an endorsement of all things Republican? Probably not. Is it a rejection of Obama's leadership in some measure? Probably so, because that's often what happens to presidents in the middle of a term. Is there's a mood on the part of the electorate to put the brakes on a little bit. But what does it mean for policy? I don't know. If there's any message from the voters, I think it's that they want both sides to work together. But somehow that message never seems to seep into Washington D.C. So we'll have to wait and see a little while whether both sides honestly heard the message that this is not an endorsement of either agenda, but really a cry from the public that we'd like you to reach across the aisle more and not simply point fingers and place blame at one another.
How can they be so tone deaf?
It's hardwired into the system. The parties each party is dominated by its own collection of interest groups, and the interest groups have really no interest in common ground. They would rather have no agreement than agreement that meets the other side part way, and so both parties are sort of hidebound by the interest groups in their ranks. We also have far fewer moderates in Congress than we used to have. When I was there, out of 435 members of Congress, we maybe had 100 evenly divided between the two parties that were somewhere in the middle of the spectrum, would cross the aisle, would work with the other side, would be a part of a bipartisan coalition to get things done. You're down to just a couple dozen people that fit that moderate role today. So that makes it a lot harder to get things done. There's no simple solution to this, but I think those are some of the reasons that despite the message voters keep trying to send, this message of work together and get things done just has a hard time being heard in Washington.
I know one of the frustrations I have, and I know people who share this frustration with me, is that it seems as if the candidates that were offered are unsatisfactory. That we who would look for the person who perhaps could fill the role that you talked about, that could step into the void.
Yeah.
And hey, let's go golfing. Let's establish a relationship. Let's find the areas that we have some common ground so we can sit down and talk about some of the things that we disagree about.
Yeah.
That they're not offered up to us as a candidate.
Yeah, very often that's true. I will give the Republicans credit that in the Senate races this year, there were more extreme candidates that were defeated in the primaries. And so Republican voters in these states across the nation did seem to be electing people who were more mainstream. And now those people have in turn been elected to the U.S. Senate. But I agree with you that over time we've had far too many candidates, and I think both parties have done this, far too many candidates that either come through the endorsing process or come through the primary, and they reflect a more extreme agenda. And that's because in those environments, either at a party convention or in a primary, you have so few people participating that the more extreme voters are the ones that dominate the selection. And then come November, you and I and the rest of the electorate are left with the option that the more extreme elements have presented. So I think that's had a lot to do with polarizing our politics in recent years. But there was maybe a sign of hope this year that even though the Republicans won and won big, this time around in the Republican nomination process, they seem to be coalescing behind candidates that are less extreme.
Okay, and you mentioned that Washington doesn't seem to get the message. Before the election, a couple months ago, we had a conversation about the big picture of, we always talk about the deficit and the debt, that there are a couple different scenarios that could play out, and only one of them offered any hope at all of some movement on that issue, and that would have been that the Republicans take the Senate.
Yeah.
Does that give you any hope at all now?
Well, especially because the 9 new senators tend to be more mainstream Republicans, and that gives me some hope that, and I think most of them campaigned on getting something done, and so maybe they are the ones that can bring the message to Washington that voters were trying to send, and that's work together, get things done, quit just pointing at one another and blaming one another. But there are some big issues to be resolved here, and so I'm hoping that this new group will have some sway within the institution. They now provide the votes that create the majority for the Republicans. And they need to be true to what they promised to do, and that's to work on these issues as opposed to just add to the gridlock. But I said prior to the election that if Democrats retain control of the Senate and Republicans continue to control the House, then the dynamic in Washington wouldn't change at all, because we'd be set up for 2 more years of the same gridlock, the same standoff. And the only possibility for changing that Washington dynamic was if the Republicans would pick up the Senate. They now have. And so to me, that at least opens the door to the possibility of a bipartisan agreement on issues in which the Republican Congress and a Democratic president have to meet one another part way. Will it happen? It's not guaranteed, but at least there's the possibility that this new balance of power could deliver some results.
Does the response, or at least, I guess not the response, but the actions of the president following the election discourage you, or?
Well, I think his decision to pursue some rather dramatic reforms of our immigration policy on his own authority by an executive order is ill-advised. I don't think it helps set the stage for the kind of bipartisan conversation and compromise that we need, not only on immigration but on a whole range of issues. And I wish he wouldn't do things like that. He waited 6 years before issuing this executive order. Why couldn't he have waited 6 more months to say, let's work on this? I've always got the executive order in my back pocket, but I'd much rather that we work on this together. It's a leadership style that I don't think is helping the cause. And the same thing happened after his reelection. Republicans 2 years ago were really chastened when they didn't win much of anything on election day. The president wins re-election, and they offered up a compromise on the tax issue, and he basically said, "No way, I want to tax the rich. I'm not going to work with you on tax reform," and he was able to ram through that increase in taxes on the wealthy. Now, whether you agree or disagree that taxing wealthy was the right thing to do, it was an opportunity for him to demonstrate to Republicans that I'll work with you on tax reform and a budget agreement. And so this is kind of the second election in a row where he's done something right after an election that doesn't engender the kind of cooperation that we're going to need on these big issues. So I wish he hadn't done it. I wish at the very least he'd given it more time and at least allowed the Republican Congress an opportunity to work with him and meet him partway on a comprehensive immigration bill.
Let me ask you this, Tim. Maybe I'm imagining a pattern, but could it be a strategy that, regardless of the outcomes of these midterm elections, that this administration and those who are, I guess, fervent backers of this administration and perhaps some of the philosophies that it's to push the envelope as far as you can, regardless of the outcome of the election and the impact on the election, because it's pretty hard to push back that tide once it moves that far down the road. Particularly when I'm looking at this, I look at Obamacare and I look at the immigration question. Both of them, according to polling numbers, pretty unpopular moves as far as the population as a whole, according to these national polls. But once they're established, it's pretty hard to undo them.
Yeah. Well, I think there might be something to that, and I think both sides are guilty of that. Do what it takes to get done what we want to get done while we've got the ability to do it. But I worry when either side takes that approach, because I think it poisons the well for the future. The big stuff that we've done in years past, civil rights, Medicare, the list goes on and on, were almost always enacted on a bipartisan vote. And if you're going to do something from healthcare reform to immigration reform to tax reform, ramming these things through on a party line vote almost invites continued acrimony and pushback. Even if you ultimately, win the day, you do so in a way that's far more disruptive and far less accepted than it would be if these major reforms had some degree of bipartisan support. So that gets me back to my point that I wish he hadn't done the executive order on this issue. First of all, it's an executive order that is more far-reaching than most executive orders, and I think it's always worrisome when any president issues an executive order that essentially changes a law by the stroke of a pen as opposed to the enactment of a law. And so, yes, it may be a bit of a tactic to get something done, knowing that it's going to be hard to undo it once it's done. But in a democracy, how you do things also matters. It's not just what your goal is; it's how you get to that goal. Because it's important for us to bring folks along, and on the big stuff, it's usually better to find at least some support across the aisle for the changes you're implementing.
I know that George Stephanopoulos asked the president a pretty pointed question about this topic, and it was regarding taxes, and he laid out a scenario, and I know it's been played out on the internet a few times too. I've seen a few blogs mention this, that what if a future president were to use his logic in regards to taxes? That you have a Congress that refuses to go along with whatever tax cut that this president wants, and because you have gridlock in Washington, I'm going to use my executive authority to change tax law.
Yeah,
and he didn't really have an answer to it.
Yeah, well, I think it's always instructive to put yourself on the other side. Would you may support the decision or the policy the president is trying to implement on his own authority, but would you feel the same way if a president of a different political party were trying to do the same thing on an issue where you strongly disagree? How would you feel then? It's always good to put the shoe on the other foot, and I think too often we get so caught up in wanting what we want that we applaud when a president does it, even though they may do it in the wrong way. That can come back to haunt us, because once you set a precedent, then the next president, who may be of a different party and with a different agenda, may start doing some things we don't like, and we wish that they would pull back and have a little more regard for the legislative process and the need for bipartisan support, et cetera.
All right, former Congressman Tim Penny on the air with us today. It's about 9 minutes away from 11 o'clock. We got a few minutes left for our show. This president, in the final, he's got 2 years left. Oftentimes, history has shown that a two-term president begins, at least this is kind of maybe it is a myth, but begins to look at their legacy. And then some things can kind of happen. Have you seen any? What worries me, I'll tell you the truth, and the Chuck Hagel thing is maybe a symptom of it. It seems as if this president has maybe a handful of people he really trusts, and the rest of them are on the periphery trying to gain influence and trying to have some sort of conversation. And their influence is very limited, to say the least. Yeah. And I'm a bit worried that may stymie this president from making some moves in his last 2 years that would be legacy moves.
Yeah. Well, let me back up to immigration first, and I would say that an immigration reform, where I would like things to end up, is probably closer to the president's point of view than to the point of view of some Republicans in Congress.
Sure.
But to me, what matters more is the way you go about it, and I think executive order is not the right way to go about immigration reform. Beyond that, immigration reform could be another legacy issue for the president if he did it in the right way. But an executive order is not. It doesn't address all of the various issues that need to be addressed, and so a comprehensive law is the way to have a legacy on immigration, not an executive order. Other than the Affordable Care Act, there's not a big legacy issue out there for the president. But if he wants that to be remembered in a positive way, then the fixes and the glitches with this law need to be addressed, and so there's an opportunity to go back to Capitol Hill and say, okay, I'm not going to sign a repeal, so, forget about that. But if there's a way to make this work better, if there's a way to make this program less disruptive, if there's a way to make it less expensive, I'm willing to work with you on those things, because we want the benefits of this increased coverage under health care to be done, and to be done as well as we can do it. I mean, there's a way to, I guess, take an issue that still garners more than 50% opposition and turn it into a better working program that has more support. I don't know what else he's got on his agenda for the balance of his term, but the other point you made about turnover is there is a sense that he may put good people in these cabinet positions, but he doesn't put them there to have an independent point of view. He's got an inner circle at the White House that have bucked back against many cabinet members. I just finished reading Leon Panetta's book, and he was both CIA director and defense secretary. And he said before he took the defense job, he was warned by Bill Gates, the guy just leaving that job, that he was often getting overruled by the inner circle at the White House. Well, why would you put talented people in charge of these departments and agencies and then overrule them by less experienced people that are on your White House staff? So I think this management style is one that is worrisome, but, it is what it is.
Yeah. I keep hoping that somehow in this last 2 years that our long-term structural debt issue and deficit issue could somehow be... You don't think...
No. I mean, I think that there are areas for bipartisan compromise, despite the president's executive order, which I think, poisons the well a little bit. I think there's still an opportunity for bipartisan immigration reform. I think because both sides could declare a victory on tax reform, I think there's some opportunity for work on that issue. But I really don't expect anything to be done on our long-term fiscal challenges. I just don't see this White House putting much focus on those issues. And between now and the 2016 election, I don't think Republicans are going to take the political risk of pushing for reforms of Social Security and Medicare when what they want is to keep control of Congress and to win the White House.
So kick the can down the road some more.
Yeah, both sides have an incentive to just kick the can, as you say.
Until we demand change. One voice at a time, Tim, right?
Yeah.
All right.
I want to believe that because I'm afraid Leon Panetta, just to quote him again, said that in Washington we either lead by we either have leadership or we have crisis, and it'd be better to have leadership. But I'm afraid when it comes to the federal budget, we may have to wait for the crisis to hit before the leaders emerge.
You've been saying that for some time.
Yeah.
All right. Former Congressman Tim Penny, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for spending some time with us.
Always. Thanks much.
You have a
good Thanksgiving.
Yeah, you as well,
to
Tim.
You and to your listeners.
And enjoy the holidays, and hopefully we'll talk to you soon.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Thanks, Tim. It's coming up on 11 o'clock, 19 degrees downtown Rochester with sunshine at KROC-AM.